There was a time in my life when I understood darkness from the inside. I knew the rituals. I knew the chants. I knew how witches look for openings in a person's life. Fear, bitterness, secret sin, spiritual laziness. And I also knew something else. Something most people on the outside never understand. There are believers who are completely untouchable. Not because they shout the loudest, not because they post the most scriptures, but because they discovered something ancient, something dangerous to the kingdom of darkness: fasting. I'm not talking about skipping a meal because you're busy. I'm not talking about dieting. I'm talking about strategic, intentional fasting that shifts the spiritual atmosphere around your life. When I was deep in witchcraft, we were taught to observe certain people before attempting any spiritual attack. We would watch for spiritual patterns. Are they consistent in prayer? Are they emotionally unstable? Are they easily offended? Are they spiritually distracted? But there was one category of people we were warned about: the ones who fast regularly. You don't hear this preached often, but in occult circles, fasting believers are considered dangerous. Not annoying, dangerous. Why? Because fasting does something that witches cannot manipulate easily. It weakens the flesh and strengthens the spirit. And when a person's spirit is strengthened, manipulation becomes difficult. Access becomes restricted. Influence becomes blocked. Let me tell you a story. There was a woman we tried to afflict. She wasn't famous. She wasn't loud. She didn't even talk much about spiritual warfare. But every time we attempted to project sickness toward her, it would bounce back. Every time we tried to cause confusion in her household, peace would settle instead. It was frustrating. We later discovered her pattern. Every week, without fail, she fasted. Sometimes one day, sometimes 3. No announcements, no social media, just discipline. That's when I learned the first fasting secret that makes you untouchable. Secret number 1. Fasting builds a spiritual firewall. When you fast consistently, you create resistance in the spiritual realm. It's like reinforcing the walls of a city. The enemy can observe you, but entry points begin to close. Your discernment sharpens. Your reactions change. You don't respond in anger the same way. You don't panic the same way. And witches rely heavily on emotional reactions. Fear is a doorway. Offense is a doorway. Unforgiveness is a doorway. But fasting silences those impulses. It humbles you. It aligns you. It makes your spirit louder than your flesh. And here's what most people don't realize. Witches often attack through timing. They wait for moments of exhaustion, moments of indulgence, moments of distraction. But fasting trains you to be spiritually alert even when your body is weak. It conditions you to stay watchful. That woman we tried to attack, eventually we stopped trying. Not because she fought us directly, but because there was no access point. Now listen carefully, because this is where most believers misunderstand what fasting really does. When I was involved in witchcraft, we were taught that every spiritual action releases energy. Every ritual sends something out. Every curse looks for a legal place to land. But what terrified us most were people who didn't just defend themselves spiritually, they had spiritual momentum. And that leads to the second fasting secret that makes you untouchable. Fasting creates spiritual authority that reverses projections. Let me explain what that means. Witchcraft often operates through projection. It sends fear, sends sickness, sends confusion, sends heaviness. It's like arrows released into the atmosphere looking for agreement. Because that's the hidden key. Darkness needs agreement. It needs a person to emotionally or spiritually receive what is being sent. But fasting breaks agreement with the flesh. When you fast, you're not just denying food. You're denying impulses. You're denying quick reactions. You're denying cravings. And every time you say no to your flesh, your spirit becomes more dominant. And when your spirit is dominant, it becomes harder for external spiritual forces to influence your internal state. I remember a particular situation that shook many of us. There was a man we targeted because he was beginning to influence others spiritually. The assignment was simple: create discouragement, then isolation, then failure. That's the usual pattern. First, we push discouragement. Subtle thoughts like, "This isn't working," or "You're alone." Then we amplify misunderstandings in relationships. Then we look for collapse. But something strange happened. Instead of withdrawing, this man began fasting. We could feel it. And I don't mean that metaphorically. In occult practices, you are trained to sense resistance in the spiritual atmosphere. His reactions changed. The emotional hooks we tried to use wouldn't latch. Situations that should have escalated into conflict dissolved into calm responses. It was like throwing fire at water. Here's what fasting does that most people never talk about. It detoxifies your soul. When you fast properly, with prayer, with humility, with focus, your thoughts begin to clear. Old emotional wounds surface and get processed. Hidden fears come up and lose power. And when those internal vulnerabilities close, external attacks lose leverage. Witchcraft feeds on unhealed emotions. It feeds on pride. It feeds on jealousy. It feeds on insecurity. It feeds on secret anger. But fasting exposes those areas inside you before the enemy can exploit them. And once exposed and surrendered, they stop being legal entry points. That's why this second secret is so powerful. Fasting doesn't just build a wall around you, it builds authority within you. Authority is different from defense. Defense blocks, authority commands. There's a shift that happens after consistent fasting. You become less reactive and more aware. You start discerning things before they manifest physically. You'll walk into a room and sense heaviness. You'll notice sudden mood shifts that aren't yours. You'll recognize when conflict is being stirred artificially. And instead of absorbing it, you neutralize it. This is where reversal begins. In witchcraft, when something is sent and it cannot land, it doesn't just disappear, it returns to its source. That's a principle many don't understand. Energy seeks resolution. If it finds no agreement, it retreats. That man I mentioned earlier, After a period of consistent fasting, the very people who were subtly working against him began exposing themselves. Confusion flipped into clarity. Accusations backfired. Opportunities opened instead of closing. From the inside, we recognized what was happening. He wasn't fighting witches, he was aligning with God. And alignment is more powerful than confrontation. Fasting aligns you. It tunes your spiritual frequency so you stop vibrating at the level of fear and start vibrating at the level of authority. And witches cannot dominate what they cannot match. There's another layer to this secret that most people miss. Fasting increases spiritual sensitivity, but it also increases spiritual weight. In the occult, we describe certain people as heavy, not physically, spiritually heavy. Their presence shifts atmospheres. Their words carry force. Their prayers feel like pressure. Those people almost always have a fasting life because fasting strips away spiritual noise. When your flesh is loud, your spirit is dull. When your flesh is quiet, your spirit becomes sharp. And sharp spirits are difficult to manipulate. Think about how many attacks succeed simply because of emotional overreaction. A small offense turns into a major conflict. A temporary setback turns into despair. A misunderstanding becomes division. Witchcraft often amplifies normal life situations. But when someone fasts regularly, their threshold for reaction rises. They pause instead of exploding. They pray instead of panicking. They forgive instead of retaliating. And that refusal to react is a nightmare for witches. Because manipulation requires response. If you don't respond emotionally, the hook has nothing to grab. That's why some of you have noticed something strange after fasting. Situations that used to trigger you don't hit the same. Drama loses its grip. Temptation weakens. Fear feels distant. It's not coincidence. It's authority. And here's the part that might shock you. Witches often test believers before launching full attacks. Small irritations, minor conflicts, subtle temptations. They're probing for weakness, looking for doors. But fasting closes those doors preemptively. It strengthens your know. It sharpens your discernment. It deepens your spiritual grounding. And once witches recognize consistent resistance, many assignments are withdrawn. Not because you're perfect, but because you're fortified. Now, this third secret is the one we feared the most. It wasn't the loud believers. It wasn't the ones constantly talking about spiritual warfare. It wasn't even the ones who knew the most scriptures. The ones we avoided were the transformed ones. The ones who had been through seasons of deep fasting and came out different. Because the third fasting secret is this: fasting attracts divine backing. Let me explain what I mean. In witchcraft, we understood spiritual hierarchies. There are levels of authority. There are ranks. There are permissions. Not every witch can touch every person. Access depends on vulnerability, spiritual covering, and resistance. But there were certain individuals who were simply marked as protected. And that protection wasn't random. It was cultivated. Fasting invites God's active involvement in your life. Not just His general love, not just His passive presence, His active intervention. There is something about voluntary sacrifice that moves heaven. When you deny your flesh consistently, not to impress people, but to seek alignment, it signals seriousness. It signals surrender. It signals dependence. And heaven responds to surrender. I remember a case that still stands out to me. There was a young woman who had recently come out of a chaotic lifestyle. Before her transformation, she was spiritually vulnerable, easy to influence, easy to intimidate. But after she encountered God, she began a pattern of fasting that shocked even her church community. Not extreme, not dramatic, just consistent. One day, a decision was made to attack her through dreams, nightmares, sleep paralysis, fear cycles. That's a common method because the conscious mind is quieter at night. But something happened that disrupted everything. Instead of fear increasing, her spiritual sensitivity increased. Instead of oppression growing, clarity grew. She would wake up and pray with precision. She would rebuke things with confidence. She began to see through spiritual manipulation, like someone turning on a light in a dark room. That's when we realized something had shifted. She wasn't fighting alone anymore. When a person fasts consistently, angels are assigned. Now, I know some people struggle with that idea, but in the spiritual realm, assistance is real, protection is real, reinforcement is real. Fasting creates invitation. Not because God is distant and needs persuasion, but because fasting removes interference. It clears static. It aligns your will with His. And when alignment happens, divine backing increases. This is why some attacks never reach certain people. It's not that witches didn't try. It's that reinforcement stood in the way. Let me say something that may challenge you. Many believers pray for protection, but few live in a way that sustains it. Protection isn't just a one-time prayer. It's a lifestyle of alignment, and fasting strengthens alignment. When you fast, hidden compromises surface. Distractions get exposed. Attachments loosen. And as those things fall away, your spiritual covering strengthens. In witchcraft, we looked for compromise first, always. Compromise creates cracks. Unrepented sin creates cracks. Persistent bitterness creates cracks. But fasting has a way of forcing self-examination. It brings conviction gently but firmly. And when conviction leads to repentance, cracks seal. A sealed life is difficult to penetrate. But here's the deepest layer of this third secret. Fasting doesn't just bring protection, it changes your spiritual scent. Yes, scent. In the spiritual realm, identity is recognizable. Just like animals recognize territory markings, spirits recognize spiritual identity. A person deeply rooted in fasting carries a different presence. It's difficult to explain unless you've seen it from the inside. Some people feel spiritually neutral, some feel vulnerable, and some feel dangerous to approach. Those are the fasters. Not because they are aggressive, but because they are consecrated. Consecration makes you spiritually costly to attack. Every time darkness attempts to engage, It encounters resistance, reinforcement, and authority combined. And after repeated failed attempts, many assignments are redirected elsewhere. That's why some believers experience constant cycles of chaos while others walk in unusual stability. Consistency in fasting builds spiritual consistency in outcomes. It doesn't mean life becomes perfect. It doesn't mean trials disappear. But it means manipulation loses effectiveness. I remember one final situation before I left that life. There was a family we tried repeatedly to destabilize. Financial pressure, misunderstandings, health scares. But every time pressure increased, they responded with prayer and fasting. Not panic, not blame, fasting. And over time, something happened that we could not override. Favor surrounded them. Opportunities came at unexpected times. Medical reports shifted. Relationships healed. And we recognized a painful truth. Their fasting had drawn divine backing that outweighed our interference. That's when I fully understood the power of what many believers treat casually. Fasting is not religious routine. It is spiritual positioning. It positions you above manipulation. It positions you beyond easy access. It positions you under divine reinforcement. And here is what I want you to understand as we close this message. You don't have to fight witches obsessively. You don't have to live paranoid. You don't have to look over your shoulder. Live consecrated. Fast consistently. Align deeply. Because when you do, you don't just block darkness. You become untouchable to it. Not because darkness disappears, but because access is denied, authority is established, and heaven stands behind you.